Good evening, and thank you for joining tonight's web seminar featuring Dr. Donna Alvermann. It's nice to see returning GCLR participants, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. We hope you will continue participating in future web seminars. Your moderators for this evening are Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy, and me, Tuba Angay-Crowder, Language and Literacy doctoral candidate. We also have a research team who have worked with this project for approximately 3 years. GCLR has provided professional development to approximately 40,000 people through its live and archived seminars and has reached people in over 160 countries across the world. Global Conversations in Literacy Research is an active research study that attempts to understand the conversations around literacy through professional development and learning in online spaces. If you wish not to be involved, please type in your name in the chat area. The collected data will provide important information for understanding the nature of web seminars to share scholarship across the world. All data is reported anonymously. During tonight's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box, and Dr. Alvermann will address these at the end of her presentation. We would love to know from where you are participating in tonight's web seminar, so please use the star tool located to the immediate left of this slide and click your location on the map. Great to see participants from different locations. Dr. Alvermann is the University of Georgia appointed Distinguished Research Professor of Language and Literacy Education. She also holds an endowed chair position, the Omer, Clyde, and Elizabeth Parr Aderhold Professor in Education. Dr. Alvermann focuses on middle grades through high school students' comprehension and production in digital environments, including social media. One of her particular interests is in understanding how online learning tools, such as Persuade Me, mediate young people's motivation and engagement in both informational and literacy texts. Further, the intersections of informal learning and pop culture figure prominently in Dr. Alvermann's professional life. She has been invited by the organizers of the 2016 South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas, to be a member of the mentor panel. Her area of specialty is developing critical awareness of the need for connected learning opportunities that unite popular culture and literacy instruction, including personalized action plans for following through on that awareness. Author of numerous articles, Dr. Alvermann has several co-authored or co-edited books to her credit: Reconceptualizing the Literacies in Adolescents' Lives, Adolescents' Online Literacies, Connecting Classrooms, Digital Media, and Popular Culture, Content Area Reading and Literacy, and Bring It to Class, Unpacking Pop Culture in Literacy Learning. Dr. Alvermann has numerous awards, including induction into the Reading Hall of Fame in 1999, Computers in Research Award from International Literacy Association, and the Oscar Cozy Award for Outstanding Contributions to Reading Research. Dr. Alvermann has recently helped to design an interactive website to learn how a community of researchers and research objects can push boundaries associated with creating and disseminating original work and remixes online using a Creative Commons license. At this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Donna Alvermann and her presentation entitled A Critical Untangling of Adolescents' Literacy Practices and Popular Culture. Dr. Alvermann, you're on.
Dr. Alvermann, I think you need to hit your talk button. We can't hear you.
Okay, I'm highlighting it.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
There, perfect. Yes, perfect. Thanks, Dr. Alvermann. You're on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. I am particularly thankful for the opportunity to speak with you this evening and to interact later during the question and answer session. I want to particularly thank the Georgia State University group that is making this webinar possible because it actually created a reason for me to go back and look over 2 decades of my work in terms of adolescent literacy practices and their intersection or not with popular culture. So with that background, let me just start by saying that I've always had a question in my mind as to whether or not we really did have to ask the question that it was even necessary to untangle. In other words, why wouldn't we just want to do things the way the kids are doing things, or adults? It doesn't have to be a particular age level. So that was my title. It took me a long time to think about that in the sense of, could I do this? Could I untangle adolescent practices and popular culture? I divided my talk into 35 minutes in which I will cover 3 basic sections. So this is just an overview of what we will be doing. First one's about 5 minutes, and that has to do with what is critique within critical theory. And the second one will be looking at formal versus informal learning. Is there a difference? And you can see by the illustration that the ideas are in our head, as illustrated there, are not necessarily in school or out of school. So that's a clue to what will be coming up in formal versus informal learning. And then finally, what research is needed. Because after looking back under 20 years of my own work, I saw some things that I wish I had done. And so I will share some areas with you that I hope will inspire you to either read further in or perhaps to conduct your own classroom-based research, a dissertation, a study, whatever it is that you're thinking of doing. So begin with, what is critique within critical theory? I would like to just briefly say that critical theory actually has 2 different meanings, possibly more, but mainly 2 different meanings with different origins and different histories. So as a result of that, what I'm about to, it's clear to me which of those 2 areas that I'm in, but I'm not sure that it would be to you. So let me say that it's not the first area which comes most recently and currently to mind, and that is critical theory coming out of sociology in the Frankfurt School. It is actually out of literary criticism, and it's a more what they call a postmodern literature, and also a postmodern critique. And Michel Foucault talks about practicing critique as a way of actually looking for underlying assumptions. I know in my classes, when I mention the word that we'll be critiquing things all semester long, some people are initially unhappy with that. They think that critique means to find fault with, or to pick at things, when they actually say they don't know enough yet about the topic to pick fault with something. But Foucault's talking about a different kind of practice of critique under the larger frame of critical theory. And his idea is, as you can see, that it's not a matter of pointing out that somebody is wrong on something and that you are right or somebody else is right, but rather it's pointing out on what kinds of assumptions, what kinds of familiar, unchallenged, unconsidered modes of thought that those practices that we accept and do every day rest on. In other words, we need to unpack what some of those practices are. And this was a good definition for me for my work, because I kept wondering why it was that whenever I mentioned popular culture, people would say, oh, that's a strange area that you're going in. There's so many problems in reading and writing. Why don't you stay within your field? They get enough popular culture outside of school. And I was told that on several different occasions. The most recent one being that I should maybe think twice before teaching a course on adolescent literacies and popular culture. That I do have supportive colleagues, and so I was able to teach it, and over the past 5 or 6 years it's become a mainstay in a course. So I think that Michel Foucault's idea of practicing critique in that definition that you're seeing on the screen now is really a good one to use with your classes if you're expecting them maybe to do more than just reflect on something that you've told them that we'll be reading as a class, and rather, can you critique it? And once they get the idea of a positive practice of critiquing, I think you'll be pleased with the work that they do. So again, a gnawing question that just wouldn't go away. Why try to untangle popular culture from young people's literacy practices anyway? And I need just to say a little bit of background information on that and why untangling has always been an issue for me. I've just sort of accepted that they have been untangled from the beginning, because as a 6th grader in an upstate rural area of New York State, I actually was deep into fandom. I was the president of the James Dean Club, and as a 6th grader, I also was the secretary for Vera Ellen. And if those two names are not in your popular culture vocabulary, think for James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause, and think about Vera Ellen in White Christmas with Bing Crosby. Those fandoms go back quite a few years. But it was always clear to me that I should not be practicing my fandom in school. I didn't even read or write or send letters off to the James Dean and Vera Ellen in school, because that was just not done in those days. And I knew that no adult would really support that. I didn't even fight it. I just knew that that was it. They were separated. So as I got older, though, I kept thinking, as I saw more and more students bringing pop culture into the classroom on T-shirts, on their lunch buckets, et cetera, et cetera. It's all over. It's in schools. And so that gnawing question wouldn't go away. Like, well, why try to untangle? So I did some research, and that will come up in another section. This all has to do with formal and informal learning. Another part of informal learning is the idea that we really there probably isn't any such thing as formal versus informal learning. Now, that's a rather radical statement, and not everybody will agree with me. A lot of people like that binary and would like to keep it as such, so that we know what goes in school formally versus what the kids are doing out of school, on the web, or whatever. And that's an idea that I don't support, and my research may or may not support it. I want to walk you through those 5 studies in a few minutes. So I don't want to say right now what it is I'm thinking, but I needed a metaphor. And Kevin Leander's metaphor, and Lavorne, a grad student that he was working with at the time, came up with a good one about context is really not a container that has no leaks in it, or it's like a sieve. And so when you think of a container, then you think of something that doesn't move from one thing to another. But when you think of a sieve, there's seepage all over. I think of this when we talk about Englishes, different kinds of Englishes. And there's Englishes spoken in European countries, in North American, South American, Asian, Australia, etc., and all in Africa. And all of these particular Englishes, when you talk with people, they seem to sound like they think it's within their continent, okay? And I don't. I think this whole notion that Kevin was able to trouble is important, and that is that we don't really, especially in a global situation that we're living in, like this global conversation right now, we are not able to put up false barriers, and we're all flowing, information is flowing freely. So I like to challenge the binaries, and one of the ways I do that is looking at some work by Deleuze and Guattari. Their whole concept of an assemblage, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but if you're interested in how to get out of this binary of formal versus informal, that would be a real good reading. But the readings are at the end of the slide presentation, so you can see them at that point. Now, I just want to warn you that if you're one of the students that might, or one of the people rather, faculty, students, teachers who might be joining us right now and thinking that's not what Kevin Leander is saying right now. He and his co-author, Dale Bolt, from Penn State, have actually come a ways away from thinking even about text as being so central to what we should be looking at when we're looking at informal learning. I'm going to leave it at that. It's a 2012 article that's in the Journal of Literacy Research. And again, this is basic to my study today, but it's not necessarily an item that I can spend a lot of time on. But do look it up if you are interested in this whole notion of informal versus formal learning. In looking back over the studies that I had conducted during the time that I was most interested in discussion in adolescent literacy, I found 5 studies in which pop culture kept creeping into the picture in big ways, actually. Although it may not have always had pop culture in the title, a study still was looking at these intersections where adolescents' literacy practices were crossing over with popular culture. The first one was just about 20 years ago when it was published, so I was actually doing it a little bit earlier than that. I did the study with the people that you see listed, a long list of people who were either at that time teachers in schools, professors at other universities, or a graduate student who was working with me at the time. And what we were looking at was middle and high school students' perceptions of how they experience text-based discussions. You see, that doesn't have the word pop culture in it, but when I did the study, pop culture kept creeping in, and that's what started to capture my attention, like, hey, there's something here. The students are not separating pop culture from their text-based discussions. But I didn't do anything about it. I needed, I guess, to wait for an invitation from Peggy Albers and her group at Georgia State to think about going back into those studies and seeing exactly what did stand out for me in terms of pop culture. And were students, was the assumption that students were keeping their pop culture out of school, like I had done when I was in the 6th grade, a long time ago. And one of the things we found across all 5 sites this was an interesting study to do because it stretched from the Northeast to the Southwest and the Southeast, took in the Southeast. And the students said that the topics and the subject matter and the tasks that teachers gave them is what would be the factors that made them either feel like they were learning or wanted to learn or would even discuss. As you can see, one student said, she summed up the whole topic of the influence of text and topics rather, when she said, now my group, you give us a good topic, and typically that was something that had to do with pop culture, by the way, when I went back to look at the data more closely. She said, you give us that and we can make a discussion. If the topic is boring, you ain't gonna hear nothing. The next study came fairly fast on the heels of the first study, and my colleagues and I who were involved in that study, again, at the top of your screen, we decided that we were not hearing much discussion in classes that were only 40 minutes long. And we figured, we knew that discussion was going on, but not always on the days that we were out in the schools. And sometimes different people had different definitions of discussion, like if a teacher was talking, like I'm talking right now, that was actually discussing the topic. So we wanted to hear what the kids were saying. So we took our studies outside of school. And at that time, yes, I was still definitely thinking there were differences in what was going on outside of school and what was going on inside of school. So I was into that binary fully. And in this particular study, which was conducted in a public library, the students in it, we had 22 to start out, and 2 dropped out for various reasons. We ended up with 20, and 2 people who were the discussion facilitators. And those 2 people were constantly taking notes on what was happening one week so that they could adjust the discussion so that they could get the kids to talk and respond to the literature in various ways. And what I found interesting in this instance was that the actual talk that the students wanted to do, they said over and over again, let's not make it like school discussion, let's not make it like school discussion. But yet the data show that they were so involved in schooling type discussions that they brought it into the library. And I went, here's another Sieve-like context. The kids are now bringing school into their popular culture discussions, and most of those books were on pop culture, by the way, much to the chagrin, as you can see, to some of the parents who were not real happy with the books that the students chose in their after-school book club. So then we did another study in 2001, and again, this was collected outside of school in the same public library. We only have one public library in Athens, Georgia, and the library wanted to be named as a site. It was not something they wanted to secret or keep secret. For an IRB or some other kind of form that we have to sign, in which we don't just close the names and locations of studies. Being a public place, they wanted to be associated with this study. What I found really interesting and a little bit ironic was, however, that while Grady, a 9th grader, said he hated to read, and when we were recruiting students to be in the study, he said, why would you want somebody who hates to read? And we said, well, I don't know. If your school's right next door, why don't you come on down to the public library and give it a try, see what you think. So we met 1.5 hours a week, and for 15 weeks, and the kids kept logs, et cetera, of what they were doing both in school and out of school. At that point, I was still thinking that the binary held. So Grady, who's a hater of reading, supposedly, he spent his Thanksgiving vacation, according to his log, poring over a Pokemon training manual in order to get ahead in his gaming skills. Now, a second irony, and maybe the biggest irony of all, it still stings a little bit, AERJ, which had published our study right before this, the reviewers rejected a write-up of this study on the basis of it having no relationship to school or learning. And we got to thinking, those of us doing this study, It looks to us like these kids are doing a lot of reading and writing. They were just learning how to use the internet and the free computers, and how to handle the printers, because they wanted to download lyrics, etc. And we kept thinking, they're learning and they're using reading and writing, and they're not in school. And who says that what they're doing outside of school isn't going to help them in school? Remember, this was early, 2001, and computers and web searches and all of that were not all that prevalent in the schools or in the library for that matter. Finally, we did a reading, not finally, fourth study was the Reading Matrix, 2007. That's a journal, an online journal. I asked many of my students to go there and read some of the studies, because there are a lot of good studies there, and it's a great place to publish if you don't like waiting around for the print copies to come out. So in that study, what we found, it was a large survey, and we had both a response rather on paper at that time it was not done online, and we also had telephone calls that we were making. And what we found was that most of the students saw connections between what they learned in and out of school. In other words, when asked what they were doing in those different places, they were able to tell us in short answers, or on the phone when we did a follow-up of a small N of the students that took the survey. One of them, a representative response was, well, if I don't learn to make connections between what I do in school and what I do on my own, then what's the point of school? I mean, why do I go to school? This study, although small in some respects, it influenced us again into thinking, the kids are now telling us that there are these connections, and why are we so stuck on, and you can go back and find articles I've written where I have informal and formal learning as opposed to each other. So I was right along with everybody else, still thinking and not convinced that there was this seepage or this sieve metaphor going on. And the last study was one that was most recently done and published in Literacy Research and Instruction. And this one was a fun one to do because we had lots of grad students as helpers. And so Jim Marshall and I would go every Saturday morning, and we would meet with 5 youths. We each had a youth that was part of a case study. And what we found, and what they did is they kept track during the week of all the websites they visited. They could tell us if they didn't, if they wanted us not to look at a particular website. We did not use any kind of tracking device or anything like that, but we told them, if you feel uncomfortable, do not talk about that website to us. These were older students, and we thought they deserved that kind of privacy. And they met for 8 months. And one of the things that I loved about the person that I worked with, whose name, he took the name God's Child. He wanted to become a preacher. The school said they did not want him preaching in school, but what he did is he used T-shirts with Christian messages inscribed on them. So, barred from preaching in the school, God's Child said in one of the interviews one Saturday morning, I just let the T-shirts do the talking. So a temporary answer to my gnawing question based on work to date. I actually have to say that I find no need anymore to untangle pop culture from young people's literacy practices. In fact, that 2012 study may have been, maybe, I'm not sure yet, maybe the last study I do in which I am wondering about whether there's a need to untangle, and if so, what does that untangling look like? Because the kids are tangling it up each time. And so my gnawing question now has an answer for me. It may not for you, it may not for studies you've done or other studies you've read, but this is just a personal journey back into how, as a researcher, I have let my practice and my research meld so that I can be out in the schools or in the libraries or any place else if I need to be. And if the binary still exists in terms of the doors that I have to walk through, that's fine. We live in a structured world still, although it's becoming less and less structured day by day. But in any case, I have kind of answered my question. But I do see a definite need for research that asks different questions. And so I'd like to spend the last part of this presentation exploring some of those other questions. These are not questions that I've pursued, but that I have read in the literature that other people have pursued. Or if they didn't pursue them, they are planning to perhaps in the future. And so I have drawn from other people's work and don't have time or space here to cite all of that work by any means, but I will say that when I talk about the different questions and who's looking at them, etc., if you want to go and read some of their own work, the work of the authors who are and researchers who are doing this work, you would be able to find them in any easy Google search or whatever. Okay, the first one. Now remember, these are not implications of what I found in answering my question, but these are picks for future research, things that I saw that I didn't ask and wished I had, or things that I now see people asking and thinking, what a great idea, and then I usually follow their work on ResearchGate or academia.edu. If you've not heard of those two websites, they're a great place to begin to interact with people whose work you like and want to be a follower. It is social media. It's a way of getting academic papers into the hands of people who would like to use them in a way that you have to be careful of copyright, etc. But there are ways in which both sites will help you understand what is the appropriate thing to do and what is not the appropriate thing to do. And different publishers have different rules and regulations about copyright, and they are always interpreted differently. So I can't go into a long spiel on that. And I would just say that as you look further and further, look up Creative Commons. That was mentioned by Tuba when she introduced me about the website. You could look at our website, but there are many Creative Commons websites. If you're not familiar with Creative Commons, go to creativecommons.com and you'll see how sharing on the web can be done legally, and you don't have to worry so much about attributions. Still a good idea to give attributions. Creative Commons even has a website that will say, you like this, like an image, you can copy it. And then the second step is now copy the attribution or the URL or the link, whatever you want to call it, and paste that under the image that you just used. It's real easy. It's like a cut and paste thing, and you can use those images without fear of having someone say that you violated copyright. And I give you these little, they may seem off target or off base right now, but I think if you're going to continue to do research with popular culture, you're going to get into a lot of multimodality, meaning that not just text anymore, just like Kevin Leander and Gail Bolt were saying, text limits, printed text limits what we can analyze. They would even say that any kind of text, like you read a dance performance, that's a text, but even that limits it, that you shouldn't be worried about producing all the time. Instead, get into the activity flow and find out how it's affecting you personally. Again, I'm not doing Kevin and Gail any disservice, I don't think, by mentioning this, but I can't go into depth in terms of what I would need to do if I were going to help in some way establish or develop a study. So the first one is, and this goes along again with what Kevin and Leander and Gail Bolt are saying in their 2013, 2012, it's listed both ways. I think there was some mix-up in JLR at that time, the Journal of Literacy Research, because on one of the pages it says one date and on the other date. And I'm looking right here at the copy, and on the front cover it does say March 2013, even though inside it has a 2012. So it'll be the same study, you may just see it cited in different ways. Okay, they think that studies should move beyond text centrism. Now, remember, not just printed text, but beyond even performance text, as I said, like a dance routine, beyond sound, like hip hop, beyond icons, beyond all of those kinds of text, and said, make the text less central and study the activity flows through which people are experiencing, especially adolescents in literacy practice, with their literacy practices, are experiencing, from my perspective, pop culture. Kevin and Gail are not limiting their article to pop culture, but I'm pulling from them to say that if I do future studies in this area, I will definitely take into account that studies must move beyond text centrism. I'm going to show you some slides in just a few minutes that will illustrate in a visual way what it is that goes along with each of these particular statements. So the second statement is another area, another gap. Studies that situate parents and teachers more prominently in the research design. Those two groups of people are left out of most of the adolescent literacy practice studies when they're using pop culture or the internet. There are reasons for that, and I will go into that in just a second when I switch slides. Studies that pose research questions respectful of young people in the now, not as if we're waiting for them to grow up and be somebody before we ask questions of them that would probably be relevant for their lives. Again, I'll illustrate that in just a minute. And finally, we need studies that give participants time to engage with their own pop culture. And here I'm speaking mostly about teachers, myself included. Okay. A new book has just come out. It's one I edited. It has excellent, has 10 chapters and an afterword, plus an introduction. And it's about connecting classrooms, digital media, and popular culture. It's a revised edition. The first edition came out maybe about 5 years ago, and this one has 5 new chapters, and it also has updates of the chapters, some of the in-press work, et cetera, that was going on at the time. I mentioned this, number one, because I'm excited, of course, about adolescents' online literacies and how those literacies are what's connecting digital media and popular culture inside classrooms. Some of the students some of the authors rather in the book from the first edition did not do their work inside a classroom. Instead, they were outside. That whole binary was still pretty strong. And still in many circles is very strong. I'm trying to critique that in a way by saying, look at the assumptions we're going on, that something's so different. So if you do read the chapters in here, you'll see those that are done inside classrooms. You'll see those that are done, quote, outside classrooms. But what you should be looking at, I think, are the connections that the kids are making. Because that's what, as teachers, we need to know what they see as connections so that our instruction is not just popularizing pop culture, but actually taking into account some of the things they like to do, but not to the point of appropriating their pop culture. You know, if you start asking questions, schoolified questions like, what's the main idea of that TV show or whatever, students, adults, and young children will turn away from that in the sense that you have now essentially appropriated what they found pleasure in, and they're not going to have anything to do with that. Now, the absent presence of parents and teachers. The absent presence is a post-structural term, meaning that the thing that isn't present in a study or in a finding is the very thing that is present, and it's by its absence is calling attention to itself. That sounds like a lot of gobbledygook, like how can you be absent and have a presence? This again is doing away with some binaries, and it takes too long to explain why it does make sense, because parents and teachers both are implicated in what these students are saying. And you can probably imagine that a lot of students would not want their parents or their teachers to know what they're doing with popular culture. So with the exception, though, of a few researchers, we really haven't had people looking at what happens when kids and parents are using pop culture or devices together. And so Tisha Lewis Allison does a nice job with that, and Jackie Marsh does, and Guy Marchand, and many others. But these were three that I use a lot in my own work when I cite. So they found that parents do not figure prominently in the research involving young people's literacy practices with popular culture, and they're doing something about it. Each of them in their own way. Tisha's starting a new study. Jackie has a book that just came out, and Guy has one that will be out shortly. And then you have teacher researchers who are studying young people's literacy practices with pop culture. And they are very familiar with findings, obviously, from their own work. In other words, these are those of us who are in the classroom, like I am doing right this semester, studying my pop culture, and the students in my master students and doctoral students in the class studying their pop culture. So there is a way of getting around this idea of, you know, that binary, like what can be known to parents or teachers and what can't be. And it's a very interesting look, not snoopy, not to be snooping, but just interesting for many reasons, I think. And then the work of students who self-identify as users and producers of popular culture is rarely rather visible to their teachers, as I said before. All right, I want to hurry along now, and here are the barriers as to why they don't. The prevailing sentiment that popular culture, popular media texts distract students, so teachers don't want to have anything to do with it in school. The other barrier being that there's an artificial dichotomy that teacher versus learners control is what's going on. When you give up some control as a teacher, then you think you've lost it all to the student. And the idea that uniform school learning versus customized online learning is something that is different and should be separated. And the third barrier is institutional authority. In other words, students aren't dumb. They know who really has the power, et cetera. And so they're not going to talk a lot about popular culture when they don't have to. Again, I go back to the new book here because it has a chapter the first chapter by Danielle Filipiak, who's looking at humanizing pedagogy through popular culture, et cetera. And I think that that's one way of breaking down that barrier. This is one of my favorite parts that Margaret Haygood talks about in her afterword in that book that I just flashed up on the screen. What do you want to be when you grow up? And that question ignores a person's identity right now. She says this is a showstopper for most students. Instead, she would argue for recognizing what they do right now. Who are you? Conveys an interest in their personhood. And will you show me how you play that video game? It's a better way than having them talk about things as if they're not really able to talk about a video game. They just play it right now, but they're not ready to talk about it in critical ways. And she's pointing out the fallacy on that. And then how might we be studying a history? What we're studying, rather, is in history. How does that connect to what you were just telling me about in this video game? It's a smooth transition. You have to be careful. It could be a way to appropriate students' pop culture. And finally, what about all of us who say we really do want to do pop culture in the classroom, but we don't really have time, we're not really that good on the web, et cetera, et cetera. And we did we did a session at Jolly recently at the University of Georgia, and we had a remix, and it was the reason for doing it. And remixing, they couldn't have gone to the web. They almost all had laptops with them. But we also had magazines and books handy that they could cut out and actually when they did this, they had a lot of fun doing it, and they preferred to do it in the physical. And that taught us something, that sometimes you need to go to old school techniques. And then they would go, we got emails later saying, we went and we did this in the class, and we also did paper cutting and pasting in the class. It just felt good to do some remixing with paper and not always online. And I thought that was a good learning that we have generated from this particular workshop that we did. So a makerspace, that's what you just saw, a place where connected learning can happen. If you're not familiar with connected learning, make sure that you look up their research agenda, which is available at the link called, that is highlighted on your screen. But if you just look up connected learning and then cross it with research, you'll get to that same link. That's a shortened link. All right, two things to keep in mind. It's not what we look at that matters, it's what we see. Okay, now just go back to informal and formal learning. It's not what we look at that matters, it's what we see. And we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. I love those two quotes and think that they really sum up, at least for me, what I have to watch for when I'm doing research. And finally, I want to thank you for being on this presentation. My time is running out, rushing a little bit here. Here's ResearchGate and academia.edu. You can look up all the articles and more that I have published on those sites for free. And thank you from here in Austin, Texas, actually, right now. And my dog Jazz is with me. And I will then briefly flip to the last slides rather, to show you that those references that I cited, and you can email me and I will provide them again, because I know I'm rushing here. And finally, I am trying to be careful about the photo credits so that all images that are not owned by me are listed here. Again, I use Creative Commons to find those URLs for the most part. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alvermann, for your insightful and engaging presentation. We now invite Dr. Alvermann to respond to the questions that participants have generated across the presentation. Please continue to type in your question in this question and answer session facilitated by Dr. Albers.
Hi, Dr. Alvermann. It's actually going to be Mandy Senna, one of the students and part of the research team here at GPLR. And we have several wonderful questions posed by our audience today. And I am going to start with, how do you think these ideas apply to adolescents who are learning in a virtual school environment?
How do I think, what was the word right before virtual learning area?
No problem. How do you think these ideas you've been discussing apply to adolescents who are learning in the virtual school?
Probably, that's a good question. I would say that it would be manifested definitely in the virtual school, probably 10 times over. In other words, they don't have, in the virtual school, it's more like a Sieve metaphor working, in the sense that they're already beyond the assumption I made about classrooms being, the self-contained that we have. So I think that what I found in my research studies would be almost like a non-question for people in a virtual school, because it's a natural, every time I say natural though, I want to stop and think, you can unpack everything as a post-structuralist. Like, what assumptions am I making about natural? There are people who are designing the curriculum for those virtual schools. So I don't know who has the power. In other words, do the kids have the power to go out and consume and produce text? And if so, what are some of the, not dangers, but what are some of the fallacies in perhaps being so text-centric? So I'm going to come full circle and say, I think it is a researchable question the more I think about it.
Great, thank you. Another question one member of our audience asks is, I think we as teachers have to rethink our role in schools, and we have to reflect on what we do. And there is an aspect that I've been wondering about during the last days. How should I start addressing literacy using technology devices with elementary school students?
Okay, I have several elementary people in my class called popular culture and classroom literacies. I don't ask them to divide themselves by grade level, but I will say that many of the people initially think, because they're in an at an elementary level, that the students will not have experience, or in some instances not have access. That's a problem for everyone. So access aside, however, they usually come out of that class because they do a final project that they start in with day one, and thinking about what it is that they will try to do as an action plan to get pop culture into the schools. Or they do, if they really are opposed to that and do not like that kind of learning, then they can figure out some other reason for doing a paper or whatever. And most of them jump in with the idea that they want to see what those elementary age students can do. And I will say, generally speaking, from past courses, I don't know what's going to happen yet in this class, but from the past, the people are amazed. And what's even more fun is when we have hangouts. I always ask for secondary people, middle grades people, and the elementary people. I even have some pre-K. To get into groups where they're not all lookalikes or teach-alikes. And at that point, it's so much fun to see what the secondary people and middle grades people say. And of course, these kids are coming to them very soon, right up to grade level. So I think that how you do that is, number one, you do some teacher research. Just like you try a few of the things, read some of these articles, try a few of the things, connect with me. I'll connect you with some elementary teachers who are doing things right now in their schools, and they'll be glad to talk with you. It does make a difference in terms of how comfortable you are as a teacher, though, in terms of wanting to start. That's why that workshop that we did at Jolly taught us quite a bit. It wasn't, we had assumed that most people would open up their laptops and just start in remixing digitally, but that didn't happen, whether they weren't comfortable doing that or whether it just felt good to have paper and scissors and paste in their hands. There is some research going on right now that's going back to getting paper into timelines and things like that, letting kids crawl along on the floor and fill in the timelines. That's actually a research line I just looked at and fell upon a few days ago and thought, well, there is something about that, the materiality of remixing.
Thank you, Dr. Alvermann. Another participant asks, I agree that there is no need to untangle pop culture from young people's literacy, but how have you seen teachers more able to see and use that value of the tangle of pop culture and literacy?
Say the how part again. For some reason, the words are getting a little bit clipped, and I'm not able. I heard everything on the first part. Start with the how.
No problem. How have you seen teachers more able to see and use the value of the tangle of pop culture and literacy in the classroom?
Okay. If I'm interpreting that question correctly, I'd have to say that I don't have research myself to answer that question. I do have anecdotal evidence, and anecdotes are fine, but they only go so far. And this is a literacy research session, so I want to be careful. Most of the people that I see able to do the untangling feel that pop culture is there anyway. Remember the t-shirt where the boy said, I let my t-shirt do the teaching in terms of preaching? So if you look around in a classroom, many teachers already are aware that pop culture is everywhere. It's not a matter of keeping it outside as an informal sort of activity, but it's what you would do with that when you see it. It's like a teachable moment, perhaps. Some people say, well, we have to be careful of the Common Core because we can only do such and such, but I have had students show in there, I didn't ask them to, they just demonstrated that there's hardly a Common Core standard in any of the core content areas that you couldn't fit pop culture into it if you wanted to. And you have to be careful, though, that you don't appropriate their pop culture. That's the part that worries me, that it will ruin the pleasure that kids get out of pop culture. I'm not sure I did a very good job answering that question. I apologize.
No, you definitely did, and I understand keeping it research-centered. The last thing we'll discuss is, why do you think that fandom is so hard to accept as a form of literacy within the classroom?
Okay, that's a good question. Again, it's a conceptual answer that I can give, and that would be based upon, I have to go back a little bit and give the history of pop culture. For a long time, popular culture was compared with high culture, okay? The idea that symphonies, for example, were better than rock music. One was high culture, one was low culture. Those binaries have been powerful. But that binary was broken, now maybe 30, 40 years ago, when one of the Walt Disney movies, Fantasia, there's a scene in there where the baton from the very upper high-class society hands the baton over to Mickey Mouse, okay, or one of the characters. And so that has been written out, and I've cited that article. It's not a study. It's an article. It's a conceptual argument. And I could definitely see how, for example, the movies have made this, have broken down that barrier between high culture and low culture.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Tuba.
Thank you again, Dr. Alvermann, for your passion and interest in examining adolescents' literacy practices and their comprehension and production in digital environments. We would appreciate you taking a moment to type into the chat area one thought about this web seminar. Please help support the GCLR research project by taking the GCLR survey. The link is located on the homepage of the GCLR website. Additionally, if you are willing to participate in a 15 or 20 minutes interview about GCLR, please type your name and email address into the chat area, and someone from the research team will contact you within a week to schedule an interview. Please join us on Sunday, April 17 at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, USA, for Dr. Sonia Nieto's presentation entitled Language Literacy and Diversity, the imperative for all teachers to address culture, race, and other differences. If you have missed any of our seminars, they can be accessed on our YouTube channel, GCLR. On behalf of the entire GCLR research team and me, Tuba Angar-Crowder, thank you all for sharing this hour with Dr. Donna Alvermann. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening or day.